Starting this painting of the girl in the rainforest watercolour again, and the first thing I do is get the bottle of spray water and I spray my pan watercolours and give the palette a fresh start, clean. Now this time I'm tackling the girl in the watercolour, so I'm watering the area. Now I apologise if my sound isn't as good as normal. My beautiful $500 Signmaster speakers have just died on me and I'll have to take them to the repair shop tomorrow. This is why I appreciate having patrons so much. Now, the first thing I'm doing is putting in the lights in the figure of the girl. That will be including her face, body, hair, her dress, everything. Just looking where the lights go and putting in the feeling of sunlight using the lemon yellow. There are a few spots that I will leave pure white. Because I've only wet the area of the girl, this colour that I'm putting in will not bleed outside of the area. Now I go in with some red and I'm looking for where my shadows are. So I'm really thinking of this as a pattern of light and shade. You want to do that with any complex subject. Don't try to think of it as a girl or arms or face, features of a face, because that can frighten you, especially if you're a new painter. Whereas if you just think in terms of a pattern of light and shade, you're not trying to paint a portrait, you're trying to give the impression of a girl standing in a rainforest. So, as I said initially, I'm using a lot of warmth in the shadow, which is represented by this dark red, which is cadmium red dark. And now I'm going into ultramarine blue. Now each time I go in with more paint, I always make sure there's a little more pigment than I had in the previous layer. So the first layer I put down is always the lightest in pigment. Then as I proceed, I use a little more pigment. The paint gets stronger in intensity with each layer that I put down. Unfortunately, as I work, my paper is drying out so that I get less bleeding. So I start off with very wet paper and then gradually I'll proceed onto slightly wet paper, and the final marks, if I do any, are done on dry paper. So you really need to be able to work reasonably quickly with watercolour, because you don't want this paper to dry out before you're ready for it to do so. If you do need to have dry paper, rather than waiting around, you can pick up a hairdryer and dry your paper. But as I don't want many hard edges, I rarely use a hairdryer these days. I much prefer to have lovely soft edges. Now it's a young girl, probably pre-teens, so figuratively she's shorter than an adult would be. So the height of the body in comparison to the head suggests the age. Probably a girl of about 10 or 11. Again, each time I go back in, I make sure I have a little more pigment than I had previously. And that's important, because otherwise you can get what's called a cauliflower effect. If you put wet paint down into a previous wash and the layer you're putting down is wetter than the previous layer and that underwash is still wet, you can get a cauliflower effect. I'll show you one day what I'm talking about. But you get a nasty watermark on the paper. So always going in with a little bit more pigment will spare you getting those watermarks that you don't want. Again, just keep thinking light and shade. If you start fiddling, move away into another area. Now I'm putting in the log, trying to suggest here a little bit of curving in the shape of the log. Yes, the log is going across water. The water will be moving So that'll be fun. Painting some moving water, and I'm going to put a suggestion of a bit of a waterfall behind. Spent many happy hikes along fern gullies like this with my family. Need to have some very strong darks and cool areas to suggest the shadows in this fern gully and their reflections in the water, and also some nice strong lights where the light will be breaking through in the open areas, and I'll need to work hard to suggest the feeling of the movement of water and also any spray from that waterfall. And I'll be taking quite a few stages through this particular painting. Suggestion of the waterfall behind. Okay, once I've chosen my colour harmony for a painting, I stick with that colour harmony. I don't suddenly introduce a new colour, and if I were to do so, I would then need to go back into the painting and reintroduce that colour throughout the painting, because nothing happens in isolation in any scene. Your colours are made up by the light effects that are affecting the whole scene. I will be varying the tone, the tonal intensity, but I won't be changing the colours. You can see I do a lot of mixing on the paper itself rather than mixing on the palette, and that way you get more variation, because your shadows are filled with variation. You'll have cold patches and warm patches, and if you were just to mix that blue and red together on your palette, it would all be the same tone, it would all be the same degree of warmth or coolness. You wouldn't have the subtle variations that you get in nature. So it's far better to learn to work wet into wet on the paper. A little bit of splashing, it is watercolour, and you want to get as much effect that this is watercolour as you can into it. Now, because the ultramarine blue and the cadmium red dark is working very nicely and not producing a shrieking bright violet, I don't need to tone this back very much. It's already coming up muted, but if I were using the cadmium red, not the cadmium red dark, and maybe something like a cobalt blue, the violet might be too bright, and I would probably need to grade back by introducing a little bit of yellow or a dark yellow, which you might think of as a brown. But I'm finding that my blue violet, ultramarine blue, and my dark red are producing enough muted tones in this violet that I'm not really needing to go in and grey it back anymore. You can see how it looks like a muted red violet in some areas and a muted blue violet in other areas, depending on the combination of the red and the blue. So there's a nice variation. I'm getting the feeling of water just being suggested at the moment. Now, of course, this is going into blue. I get in there and I'll work that red into it while it's still wet, while those colours will still bleed out. And here I've added a little bit of yellow. And now you're getting a little bit of olive green appearance, not by having mixed olive green on the palette, but by just introducing a little bit of yellow into that previous mixture. And you're getting a very natural looking green. And this would be what you would call a tertiary colour, because it's three colours mixed together. Remember, primary is one pigment, secondary is two pigments mixed together, two pure pigments, and a tertiary is when you have three colours all mixed together. And that's where a lot of artists can get into mud. If you just were to mix all of those on the palette to just one flat bland mixture, you would have mud. So mixing on the paper, you have more control. See you in the next tutorial, and thank you for watching, and thank you for respecting the copyright of artists.